to understand the motives behind those who perpetrated these crimes.
Has the UK now learnt its lesson? Could the grooming gang scandal happen again?
The Home Office, under a Conservative government in 2020, put out a report, not sure if you've seen it, got a lot of coverage, saying that the majority of men in grooming gangs, which is not a great phrase, are white men under the age of 30.
Hello and welcome to the first video on my channel where you can actually see me. Minus the mask, of course, because I tend to talk about the mostly peaceful followers of the religion of peace sometimes. For today's topic, I'm sure you've probably heard the discourse around the UK the past couple of days. It used to be one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen and was largely responsible for the creation of other great countries like the United States, Canada and Australia. And not too long ago, it's the country that blessed us with the other Queen, David Beckham and Harry Potter. When you hear about the UK now, you don't think great empire. You think a former empire grasping for air as it does a slow, painful death. But even before Elon Musk turned the grooming scandal into the #1 headline worldwide, the UK had already been struggling. What you're watching is a downfall on two fronts: an economy that's circling the drain and, frankly, a culture collapsing under the pressures of mass immigration and the growing influence of Islam. Let's start with the economy. The UK is the only economy in the G7 where real household disposable income per head hasn't recovered to its pre-pandemic levels. And then there's the worst decline in living standards among G7 nations. Imagine this. Not only are wages stagnant, but everything is more expensive. Heating, luxury, groceries, good luck. A bit of joy, forget it. And it gets better. Britain actually used to have one of the highest productivity rates in the G7, growing at a steady 2% annually. But then, 2008 came along and hit the country like a bus. Since then, productivity growth has plummeted to basically zero and stayed there. The UK now ranks as the second lowest in productivity among G7 nations. That's right, second to last. Who's last, you ask? Italy. At least the Italians have pizza to distract them from the mess. Britain, not so much.
Oh my God!
So, what about housing? If you're in the UK and looking for a place to rent, I hope you've got deep pockets or a very forgiving friend with a spare couch. Take London, for instance. The average rent there hit £2,200 in October 2024, the highest it's been since they started keeping track. And it's not just a London problem. Across the UK, rents jumped by a staggering 9.1% in the past year. That's right, almost double-digit increases in a single year. And the bad news? It's only going to get worse. Experts predict that rents will climb another 18% by 2029, while wages will lag behind at a measly 15%. Why? Well, there just aren't enough rental properties to go around. Okay, so you can't rent, but you can save up and just buy a place, right? Wrong! Today, the average house in England is close to 10 times the average household income, making home ownership increasingly difficult. The average house price in the UK rose over 3% last year, with prices expected to increase this year as well. So, even if you manage to squirrel away enough for a down payment, perhaps by foregoing luxuries like food and heating, you'll still face enormous mortgage payments. Now, while all this was going on, the UK has been struggling with an exponential increase in immigration, an issue so significant that they ended up leaving the EU. Immigration has set the stage for a record-breaking population boom, because apparently, when it comes to the UK, more really is merrier. For the first time in 50 years, deaths actually outpaced births in Britain, but thanks to a surge in net migration, the population still managed to skyrocket. By mid-2023, there were almost 70 million people living in the UK, which is wild when you think about it. That's over a 660,000 person jump from 2022, the biggest annual increase since they started keeping track in 1971. Just in the year leading up to mid-2022, more than 1.1 million residence visas were granted to non-UK nationals, a figure that's almost equivalent to the entire population of Birmingham. the UK's second largest city. Of course, sentiment around immigration had soured quite significantly by that point. Despite endless promises to get immigration under control, successive governments have consistently dropped the ball, leaving a massive credibility gap and fueling public frustration. To make matters worse, just 3 years after Brexit, an event largely driven by calls to reduce immigration, net immigration hit a record-breaking 606,000 people. And here's the kicker. The majority of this migration came from non-EU countries. So much for taking back control, huh? By 2022, faith in the government's handling of immigration had plummeted, with only 11% of the population believing they were doing a good job. It's safe to say the public isn't exactly convinced. And this is where the cultural collapse starts to rear its ugly head, as the strain of mass immigration and the challenges of integration begin to unravel the fabric of British society. A large number of these immigrants came from societies that, let's be honest, have nothing in common with British or even Western society, and a large number of these immigrants were Muslim from countries like Pakistan. As I've said on this channel many times, many Western countries and their inhabitants are incredibly naive about a sudden, mass influx of Muslims and the creation of parallel societies within cities. Governments pretend that you can take somebody from, say, Pakistan with extremely misogynistic, homophobic, and anti-West beliefs, put that person on a plane to London, and suddenly he's some sort of model citizen who embraces progressive values and seamlessly integrates into British society. This is pure delusion. Cultural relativity simply doesn't work when it means tolerating intolerance or excusing harmful beliefs just because they come from a different part of the world. But the UK, it turns out, is full of cultural relativists. Cultural relativists who've bent over and allowed the UK to not just become a hotbed of terrorism, but a breeding ground for Muslim Brotherhood affiliates. Let me introduce you to someone whose work is more relevant now than ever, Samuel Huntington. He's a political scientist behind the clash of civilizations, one of the most influential and debated political theories of the modern era. His central argument was that the defining conflicts of the post-Cold War world wouldn't revolve around borders or ideologies like capitalism versus communism. Instead, they would be cultural. He believed civilizations, broadly defined by shared histories, religions, languages, and values, would clash when their fundamental principles came into contact. And he argued that these differences, rooted in centuries of history, would not easily be reconciled. Take Islam, for example. Huntington identified it as a civilization that would face significant challenges integrating with the West. Why? Because its principles often conflict with core Western values like secularism, gender equality, and individual liberty. He warned that ignoring these tensions or attempting to paper over them with cultural relativism wouldn't solve the problem, it would make it worse. Now, look at the UK today. What do we see? Massive immigration from countries with cultural values that couldn't be more different from those of the West. A refusal to address these differences head on, and the creation of parallel societies, groups that reject integration altogether and operate by their own norms. He wrote about this decades ago, warning what could happen if these clashes were ignored. The UK, whether it likes it or not, has become a case study in what happens when cultural differences are left unaddressed. A place where blasphemy laws are, in practice, being enforced.
Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religion?
Where people are getting arrest warrants over social media posts, and where parents of trafficked girls are being treated like criminals just for speaking out about their children's abuse. But perhaps worst of all, sectarian politics have now crept in, with failures in institutions across every level. Last year, this became very apparent. One of the instances of this was the election. Obviously, the British people were very tired of the Tories, and Labour won by a lot. What perhaps was missed by quite a number of people was a brand new sectarian power that had apparently come out of nowhere, a group called Muslim Votes Matter, which essentially identified areas where large numbers of Muslims lived and ran candidates in those areas. Their primary goal? Influence British foreign policy in relation to Gaza. And boy were they successful. They won as many seats as Reform, Nigel Farage's party that was seen as a new chapter in British politics. But instead of Reform gaining ground with significantly more votes, these Islamist groups managed to secure the same level of political influence. Now, you might be thinking, how's this really relevant to changing culture? Well, by the time this group won those seats, Britain had already undergone a huge transformation. One of the candidates who barely beat out her opponent turned out to be Jess Phillips. Just 700 votes won her the seat. The significant Muslim population in her electorate supported a pro-Palestine opponent, and Phillips described the campaign as the worst election she had ever stood in. You might have seen Jess Phillips in the news recently. Elon Musk, the man who blew up the grooming gang scandal, which I'll get to in a second, recently called for her to be jailed, among other things. Are you seeing why I brought her up? Because political pressure from these sectarian groups, who by the way mostly are concerned about a foreign country, can absolutely influence domestic issues, such as the failure to thoroughly investigate grooming gangs. These horrific crimes are allowed to persist because of political appeasement and the fear of alienating a religious voter bloc. The sheer number and influence Islamist groups have in the UK were made even more evident in the aftermath of Israel's response in Gaza, with mass protests in cities like London. After debates on Gaza, an MP even confessed to weighing his own physical safety before deciding how to vote. This clearly demonstrates that Islam is shaping British politics not through dialogue or peaceful engagement, but through tactics of fear and intimidation. And this is where the grooming scandals come in. These scandals were underreported by some media and even covered up. That's why it's so important to know who owns the media and understand their biases, and that's where Ground News comes in. Ground News is an app and website that compiles thousands of news articles into one place to give you the complete picture, including biases and who actually owns the media source. They've become invaluable for me and makes it easy to see how different media sources frame the same event. Take this article on the MPs voting against a national inquiry into the grooming gangs. Ground News reveals that 57% of the sources reporting on this story lean right, while only 18% lean left, making this a potential blind spot for that side. Looking at the headlines, some left-wing sources, like the London Economic, reported heavily on Elon Musk's input on this issue, whereas some right-leaning media, such as The Telegraph, which first broke the scandal, presented the views of survivors. The centre, like the Oldham Times, instead avoided using loaded language and focused on the national inquiry instead. This kind of biased distribution shows us how narratives are shaped and which perspectives might be underrepresented. Another feature I love is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that the left or right might be overlooking. It's especially helpful if you want a full understanding of the issues beyond what you see on social media. You can also sign up to their Blind Spot Report, a newsletter that shows what's happening at the extremes of news bias, and have it come straight to your inbox. It helps you see how each side frames major issues and what they might be ignoring. I've been a user for years now, and I genuinely think you'd love their platform as well, which you can check out at ground.news/dingo. Go check them out at ground.news/dingo or scan the QR code on screen to get started. You can join for less than $1 a month, or use my link in the description to get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now, let's jump back in. Over the past week, I've wondered why the whole of the UK didn't fall into mass civil unrest. With anger from both sides of the political aisle, institutions, and well, pretty much everyone with a moral compass. But that's not what happened. Let's go back to the beginning, because this scandal didn't just appear out of nowhere. In 2011, The Times published an expose detailing how gangs of predominantly Pakistani Muslim men were targeting, grooming, and sexually abusing young girls, many of whom were in the care of social services. The investigation was led by journalist Andrew Norfolk, who uncovered shocking patterns of abuse that have been allowed to continue for years, if not decades. These weren't isolated incidents either. This was systematic, happening in towns and cities across the UK, including Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford. The scale of abuse was staggering. In Rotherham alone, it was later revealed that over 1,400 children had been abused between 1997 and 2013. Think about that for a moment. 1,400 children. It gets worse. The real scandal lay in how institutions designed to protect these children, police, social workers, and local councils, turned a blind eye. Why? A fear of being labelled racist or Islamophobic. the tactics used by these gangs were as insidious as they were horrifying. Vulnerable girls, often from troubled backgrounds, were targeted and manipulated with gifts, alcohol, and drugs. One of the most egregious cases involved Shabir Ahmed, the ringleader of the Rochdale grooming gang. Shockingly, Ahmed was employed as a welfare rights officer by Oldham Council and was seconded to the Oldham Pakistani Community Centre during his tenure. Despite multiple concerns raised about his behaviour and even his arrest, the police failed to inform his employers. In fact, a Home Office whistleblower who tried to tell police and superiors what was going on was sent on a DEI training course instead, with his allegations deemed racist. Parents who tried to take action were also arrested by the police. Local politicians avoided the issue altogether, terrified of the backlash addressing it might provoke. In one particularly damning case, a council whistleblower revealed that staff were explicitly told not to identify the ethnic or religious backgrounds of the perpetrators for fear of causing offence. These cases primarily occurred in post-industrial towns and cities across the UK, places already grappling with economic decline, strained public services, and high levels of social deprivation. For the elites in power, it was very easy to shrug off these communities' concerns, labeling them as sensationalist or even bigoted. After all, these were the forgotten towns, the places where economic opportunity had dried up and the people felt abandoned by the system. To the British elite and institutions, not being labelled racist was more important. This happened over a few decades ago and was mostly buried and brushed off. Most Western nations apparently didn't even know this had happened. Until a few days ago, of course, when the world's richest man, Elon Musk, started talking about it. And now, Britain has become the great shame of the West. To be fair, this is not a failure of Britain's working class. The blame lies squarely on those entrusted with protecting the very people who make up that working class. As I've discussed previously on this channel, there's a kind of narcissism that runs rampant among the elites, a belief that they know what's best for everyone else. And their hyper-liberal values have utterly dismantled a long-standing culture rooted in shared traditions, national pride, and a sense of community. They've replaced it with a fragmented society, where anything resembling cohesion is sacrificed on the altar of tolerance and progressivism. And at the heart of this cultural destruction lies the relentless effort to shield Islam from any criticism, no matter the cost to the very culture they're supposed to protect. Criticism of harmful practices within Islamic communities is immediately shut down, dismissed as Islamophobia, and those who dare to raise concerns are often vilified or silenced. I mean, just take a look at this statistic. It's staggering. In Telford, 1 in 8 Muslims were implicated in grooming young girls. In Hume, it was 1 in 11. In Hull, 1 in 22. Rotherham, 1 in 38. Dewsbury and Batley, 1 in 44. Or look at how these people responded to this girl talking about these gangs on the BBC.
I grew up in Bradford, alright? And in that kind of environment, it is mainly Asian men, not because it's something about their culture, but because they're not getting caught. Like, I've had friends who've been raped and the police have told them that because it's an Asian man that's done it, probably not going to catch them. But it happens all the time.
What has anything to do with not catching them?
I don't know
Because
what
they're not
planet it is.
engaging.
Okay, no,
The
yeah.
police are too scared of being called racist to do anything.
This reeks of a broken society. A society so far detached from what it used to be that the UAE is now sanctioning extremist organisations in the UK. And to be honest, I almost always see extremist Dawa bros or other Islamic crazies primarily from the UK these days. It's become a weird stereotype almost. What's particularly striking is that while Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are actively distancing themselves from extremist ideologies, the UK appears to be entrenching itself further into this quagmire. Of course, many of these states do need to modernise by necessity and move away from those sweet petrodollars. But looking at their neighbours, it's clear they have all realised that pandering to Islamists or even giving them any power does not work out well over the long term. Yes, a lot of it is hyper-capitalist window dressing designed to enhance their global image, but even so, the progress they're making is undeniable. And doing so, the contrast it creates in a country like the UK should ideally be a wake-up call. But in the UK, instead of recognising this contrast as a wake-up call, the political class seems to be doubling down on appeasement. And why? Simple. As I said before, votes. When political expediency takes precedence over core values, the result is more than just poor governance. It's a society losing its identity. Take the rise of Sharia courts across the UK. There are now over 85 unofficial courts operating in the country, settling disputes on everything from family law to financial matters, completely outside the jurisdiction of British law. Or look at the increasing prevalence of halal food. It's now so widespread that in some areas, it's becoming difficult to find non-halal options. And then there are things like dog-free zones, introduced in some areas to accommodate Islamic beliefs. Some Welsh organisations are even resorting to using young schoolgirls to encourage refugees to relocate there. And as you may have seen in the past few days, the political class are doing everything they can to minimise the grooming scandal story or silence victims. It's hard to imagine how anyone with a moral compass could see this as acceptable. These are all symptoms of a broader cultural collapse. A society that once prided itself on its values of equality, secularism, and individual liberty is now contorting itself to accommodate ideologies that stand in direct opposition to those principles. This is the same nation that cracked the Enigma Code, helping to defeat the Nazis and turn the tide of World War II. Fast forward to today, it's hard to believe this is the same country. The resilience and unity that once defined Britain feel like a distant memory. Britain no longer inspires. Whether it be colonial guilt or mass naive idealism, or a combination of both, the results speak for themselves. Having been born in a fully Islamic nation that fell into extremism, I know what such a society does to human beings, to development, to human rights, to gender equality. I could go on. For Britain, the story isn't over. There's still time to rewrite the ending. The cracks can be mended, the light restored, but it requires more than silence. It demands courage, honesty, and the will to act before what Britain once stood for fades into the past. This is the moment to rise, to remember the resilience and unity that built Britain, and to ensure that the greatness of its history doesn't become just a wistful memory. The future isn't lost, but it won't wait forever. The time for change is now. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give the video a like. I would also love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment down below and let me know what you think. A huge thank you to my current channel members and Patreon supporters. Your support makes all of this possible. And if you'd like to join them, consider becoming a member by hitting the join button below or heading over to Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.